Welcome to Safety Talk. Personal safety expert Pete Canavan shares his insights and interviews experts who provide simple and effective tips, techniques, and technologies to keep you safe and secure both online and off. Here's Pete.
Hello, and welcome to Safety Talk. I'm your host and personal safety expert, Pete Canavan. I bring over 25 years of personal safety and online security as the host of this show. My company provides a range of personal safety and security solutions in both the digital world and the physical world. Now, I do this through speaking and workshops, online courses, and consulting to corporations, colleges, and at conferences. To learn more, you can always visit my personal website at petecanavan.com. So we've got another incredible guest for you guys today who will be talking about another perspective on safety. This episode will be of major value to any and every company out there, since we're going to be talking about the safety and security of your business, of your organization. And we're going to touch on policies. We're going to touch on workplace violence. We're going to touch on terrorism a little bit. We're going to see where the conversation takes us. So it's sure to be a great show. So we're going to get rocking and rolling here. So our guest today is the Senior Security and Intelligence Consultant at Blue Glacier Security and Intelligence. They've experience in training in intelligence, risk, threat and vulnerability assessments, executive protection, business continuity, and counterterrorism. He has previously served as a military intelligence officer, and of course we thank him for his service. And he's a certified protection professional, CPP, through ACES International. In addition to him being a presenter and a writer, he holds not one but two master's degrees, one in global risk from Johns Hopkins University and one in military operational art and science from the U.S. Air Force's Air Command and Staff College. He has led community continuity planning and risk assessments for the U.S. government, for private industry. He has overhauled the major U.S. counterterrorism plan for the Middle East. And he's also presented at the Global Security Exchange on security risks to the 2020 Olympics, which will be coming up next year. Also familiar with hardening concerts and special events, which unfortunately, as we've seen, has been something that we need these days. So it is with my great pleasure to welcome Mr. K.Campbell to Safety Talk. Welcome. Thanks for being on.
Thanks for having me on, Pete. So, love your show. Love your podcast.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. We try to bring on people and, a lot of different perspectives to safety, different companies, different products, different technologies. And, obviously we're all about improving safety, improving security. And I'm excited to have you on so we can talk about, some of the things that you're an expert in and the safety and security policies and why, really they're vitally important organizations, especially today. And, businesses get, I think, overwhelmed at times. They don't really know where to start. So I briefly mentioned at the start of the show, and I think you would agree that that's something that has become of paramount importance for people today, right?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, some things are often overlooked or neglected in the security field.
Now, one thing that I asked my guests, and yourself included, to do is to write down one sentence to me that describes the problem that you or your company solves in society, in business, or in the world. And it's a heavy question, and it's one that really requires the guest to go and sort of really summarize in one sentence what it is that they do. And it was interesting because your answer was risk illiteracy, and that it is pervasive in society and the business world. And that what Blue Glacier does is they improve the public's and their clients' understanding and awareness of those risks, thereby increasing their risk literacy. So I really like that. And I just want to kind of get your thoughts on that, and before we dive in with some of our more specific questions for you.
Sure. It's a term. I can't take credit for the term risk illiteracy, but I think there's a professor somewhere in the Northeast that came up with that. But basically, if you look at everything from how the public perceives the risk of active shooter to terrorism, there's a lot of risk illiteracy in the world. And when it comes to businesses, it's also prevalent there too. So you have businesses that don't know their risk. They're risk illiterate because they haven't done a risk assessment, right? So they install $1,000 worth of cameras and without having the benefit of a risk assessment, right? So we try to increase the risk literacy of not only clients but also general public. So you'll see in our social media post, for example, we try to inform the public of things that might not be covered on the news. For example, last week, I think it was just about 70 soldiers died in Niger, right? Terrorist attack. Not sure no one has really claimed responsibility for it, as far as I know. But you never see that on the news, right?
Right.
Unless if it's in Europe, you'll hear about it. But in Niger, you won't. So there is a perception that France has it so bad. They do, but realize other countries in the world have it even worse. And so that's an example of the risk increase in the public's risk literacy.
Yeah, one of the things that I have on my safetytalkpodcast.com site is a news aggregator. So I pull in a lot of safety and security news from all over the place. And it amazes me that I learn about all kinds of things because of that. And it's very difficult to stay on top of things because, I mean, unfortunately, as you know, things are happening all the time. Yeah. And you're right. If it's not, somewhere that somebody may be considering going on vacation or visiting, or if it's not, one of the larger, more well-known countries like in the U.S. and Europe or in Canada or something like that, like you're saying, in some third world countries, people kind of brush it off. But, it's not something that we can ignore because these problems are global. These problems happen all the time. We have people that are bent on doing harm to everyone and anyone in a lot of cases, no matter where they are. And it's really sad. It's really upsetting, and it's infuriating. And it makes me really angry that, people think killing innocent lives is somehow making a statement that's going to further their cause.
Exactly.
And it just, it doesn't. If anything, it paints a target on you and your cause, and it makes you out to be the person that nobody wants to deal with. And then, companies like the United States and our allies, we do everything possible to try and eradicate those vile, bugs. I don't even want to give them the credit of being human, because they're unbelievable in how they act, their mindset. And unfortunately, it's something that is ingrained in a lot of these people from the time they're kids. So from the time they're very young, they're taught that, freedom is bad, the United States is evil, and they're sort of brainwashed. And it's a really hard thing, I think, for anybody to try to sort of change that narrative, because in order to do so, we've got to somehow get to these people, these kids, when they're very young and change that narrative. I mean, would you agree with that?
I completely agree. It's not impossible, but what we find, unfortunately, in most countries, we tend to focus on the more sexy stuff of going after the bad guys, right? And that was one of my jobs. I loved, where I would offer recommendations how to degrade, disrupt these terrorist groups and individuals. But
that's awesome, man. Kick butt.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It was a lot of work, sometimes stressful. Get something wrong.
Yeah.
You can end up being court-martialed, go to jail, which is correct, which is good. Because we try to minimize mistakes. But yeah, going after the ideology is actually as important, if not more important, and it's not something that policymakers tend to focus on, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's crazy. So let's start off by talking about the importance of, to sort of bring this home here, the importance of an organization's safety and security policies. So like what do these policies look like, and why are they important for businesses, especially today?
So, a policy is basically how an organization sets goals, or it's the goals and objectives of an organization, right? That's what it is. It's basically what the organization wants to do, the mandatory statement of what an organization wants to do in terms of security, but also anything else, drug substance abuse, workplace violence. So these are very high level. It's a very high level statement that's mandatory. And when I say mandatory, that's important because if there's no disciplinary action behind the violation of said rule, then it's not it's not really a policy. What I find is that many organizations, they don't have that in place, and it's important not just for nonprofits but also for profit organizations, right? No matter what even houses of worship need to have a policy. You know, you go into any house of worship and ask, okay, you want a risk assessment? Where can I see your policy? And a lot of folks don't have it.
Right. Now, I had somebody on the show, and they specifically are working on protecting houses of worship, and they did a virtual summit that I was privileged to be a part of, in talking about, you know, what can we do to protect houses of worship, and that was Mr. George Wheeler from Shadow Track 24/7. And so, if anybody's not familiar with that organization, that is exactly what they do. They do a lot of safety and security, but yeah, houses of worship is a biggie. And, you know, we've seen that, unfortunately, be something that's in the news now, where it's like, you know, nowhere is safe, you know, but
Right.
churches and synagogues and temples. And it's like, it's absolutely crazy. It's like, you know, people are trying to gather to pray and to worship and to, you know, get together with the community, and,
Right.
you know, nowhere is safe. You're constantly, you know, looking over your shoulder. And
Right.
it's a scary thing. So I'm pulling up your site now, because you do have risk assessment services, you know, obviously not just for houses of worship, but, you know, for all different types of businesses,
Right.
commercial facilities, you know, private residences, et cetera. So that's fantastic. So I encourage anybody to go to blueglacierllc.com to look at that. So let's look at, so we have policies and we have procedures, right?
Right.
Can you explain the difference between the two, and the important differentiation between those two?
Sure, and this can be confusing for a lot of folks. A client, during the preliminary survey I did for a potential client, the domain POC wondering, hey, what's the difference between policy and procedure? It can be confusing. The way I like to relay it is, policy is what an organization wants to do, and procedure is how you want to do it. Right. So that mandatory statement, this is what we want. We want to ensure that that we have 360 degrees, all entrances have access control. Violence, workplace violence prevention is a top priority for us. That's what. How is, okay, we are going to have contract guards or non-contract guards. It's the how. How you're going to do it.
The specifics of it.
Both are important for legal and regulatory reasons. In addition to establishing buy-in from senior management. The security policy shouldn't be signed by the security chief, the CSO. Ideally, it's signed by the CEO or COO or some other executive or of the organization, or, you know, if it's a house of worship, the lead, the pastor or whatever that might.
The person where the buck stops with them, right?
Exactly, and same with workplace violence prevention policy.
Now, I think, you know, anymore we're seeing that we have a big legal portion of this, right? Because
Right.
we're seeing insurance companies requiring policies and procedures. They want to know, you know, what do you have in place if there is something that happens? How are you going to mitigate your risks? How are you going to recover from those risks? You know, show us proof of your compliance. Show us proof of that things that you're using, software-wise, operating system, antivirus, firewalls, whatever. Make sure that stuff's all up to date, et cetera. So from a legal perspective, it's obviously important to have those policies in place. Could you maybe expand a little bit on the the legal reasons for having those safety and security policies.
Sure, and this is the of course it's important to have that CEO buy-in, right, or executive buy-in, but legally, no organization wants to be at the receiving end of a lawsuit because something happened. Say worst case scenario, active shooter, extremely rare. I shouldn't say extremely rare, but they are rare, contrary to popular belief. Whether it's a school or business or house of worship, they're rare. But the impact,
better chance of getting struck by lightning twice than being a victim of an active shooter, I would say. But still, you don't want to take your chances, right?
Exactly, because the impact is huge, not only emotionally, but potentially on the bottom line over the organization, especially if it's a profit organization, if it's an organization that's in the business to make money, right? So when something happens and you don't have a policy in place, smart lawyers are going to come after you, and arguably rightfully so, right? So those are some of the legal ramifications of not having a policy. Regulatory reasons include OSHA, the Safety and Health Administration under the Department of Labor. Under their general duty clause, they mandate that that organizations have some kind of policy to guarantee a safe workplace. Right. And I've seen if you do a search for OSHA fine violence, OSHA does not mess around with that. I think the largest I've seen so far is about almost $250,000 fine on a health organization somewhere up north a few years ago. At the state level, you have the state equivalent of OSHA for all, if not most states, and they also have requirements. So that's why it's not only good business practice, but you want to have to meet your regulatory requirements, you want to have policies in place and procedures.
Sure, because it can protect you, and I mean that's the bottom line. I mean, you're trying to protect the people that are, in your care if you're a business, and those are employees at the workplace. You want to be protecting the customers and their data that's in your systems. Yeah. And so you've got to have a plan. And one of the things that I do is cybersecurity plan development. I have a 7-step basically course that says, okay, here's what you do. Step 1, step 2, step 3, and it takes you right through. And at the end of those 7 steps, you've got a plan. You know what the risks are, you know what the realistic risks are in those threats, and then how to deal with those. And you have a plan for recovery for that business continuity piece, which is huge, because we all know that something can put a company out of business very quickly if they're not prepared for it. Exactly. If you're a business that's a for-profit business, and something impacts your ability to generate and pull in that money, and it impacts you for not just days, but maybe a couple of weeks, that may be all it takes to put you out of business, especially if you're a big business bringing in a lot of money on a daily basis. Right. And so that's a big it's a huge thing that companies have to get serious about, and if you're not already doing it on your own voluntarily, you're going to be forced to do it sooner rather than later. So you might as well, turn around and do some research and figure out, hey, what do I got to do? How much do I got to spend? Do I have to hire people? Yes or no? And that's where you turn to somebody like myself, you turn to somebody like you, like someone who is familiar with what has to be done, and then you figure out, what to do it. So business-wise, who would you say is the person that would be the one that you are talking with at the organization? Is it the business owner, or the president, or would it be, like a CSO, CISO, CIO, somebody like that?
So, when we go, it's usually someone below the CEO, COO level or equivalent that we speak to. But the highest level possible when we're doing a risk assessment, right? Because a lot of times you want to find out what the concerns are. okay, before we do this risk assessment, what are your concerns? And the higher level that comes from, the better. So ideally, the CEO would be part of that, part of the interviews that we have, or or right below that level. In terms of the policy, or helping write the policy, for example, business continuity policy. The Ideally, perfect world, the CEO would be the person we're working with to at minimum get input on that policy, before we draft it. The higher the level, the better.
Sure. And, something that affects a big company, that's going to affect everybody, right? The board of directors is going to be impacted, shareholders, anybody that has a stake in that company. So making sure that they understand the impact that it's going to have, potentially that ripple effect throughout the entire organization, top to bottom, as well as, going out to, like I said, to like shareholders and people like that. That's a big thing. So obviously, policies, procedures, they're all great. Are there any negatives or downsides to policies that you put in place? Maybe too restrictive? What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Too restrictive, too detailed, like, hey, this shouldn't be in there. It's a procedure. It's how you're getting it too into the weeds. So that's one potential downfall. If they're too restrictive. The other is if it's not in line with the culture of the organization. So it's great, especially as consultants, to go in and say, okay, here's what, in case they want us to do that, or if they hire us to do the risk management piece after the risk assessment piece, okay, help us draft the policy. If that policy is not in line with the culture of the organization, then that's a bad thing, right?
That's a huge thing that you just said. Right. And I think we need to take a minute to talk about that, because you guys probably do the same thing, which is when you come in, you got to look at what's the mission of the company, right? What's their vision? Where do they want to go? What do they stand for? And what is the corporate culture? Right. Because if you put too restrictive policies and procedures in place that stymie or go run counter to the corporate culture, there's going to be a problem, and people aren't going to follow those policies and procedures. For example, if you've got a cutting edge like software development company, well, you've got to kind of have not as restrictive policies and procedures in place that allow some sort of latitude with development, because otherwise you're going to lose your competitive advantage. On the flip side, you need to have very restrictive policies and procedures in place for a place like a financial institution. Exactly. Where you're touching dollars every day, or an investment firm, something like that. So,
which also, by the way, has regulatory requirements also, if not legal requirements, as in federal law, or depending on where they are, even state law.
Yeah, but corporate culture is huge, so you have to make sure. I mean, right from the get-go, hey, what's the culture at your company, and make sure that the things that you do and the policies and procedures you put in place are going to be in line with that.
Exactly.
Otherwise, it'll blow up. It just won't work. You put things in place, and people aren't going to follow them because it runs counter to how things work there, essentially.
Exactly.
All right, so I'm sorry. Go on.
And that's very important, because you need once you get that buy-in from the bosses, that's important, and then and then it flows downhill from there. Too restrictive, it doesn't pay attention to the culture. If it's inconsistent with the culture of an organization, then that just that reduces the likelihood of buy-in from the top folks. So that's really important.
Now, something you talked about earlier, and I want to kind of switch gears and talk about that, and that's one of the subset of safety and security, where having policies and procedures can really help in a concrete situation, such as having a workplace violence policy, for example. That's a big thing now. A lot of companies need to address this, because we're seeing it happen, again, with, increasing frequency, and it's unfortunate. But for those companies out there that maybe don't have one, or those that do have one and would like to get your insights to it, what should their workplace violence policy sort of look like? Like, what should it include? Obviously, we can't go into every part of it, but kind of as a high level sort of summary of that.
Sure. So there are several things, but if I had to narrow it down to the top three, One, it needs to define the what there's zero policy for, zero tolerance for, right? So it needs to define threats, behavior, and actual acts of violence. That's very important, and also where that applies to. A lot of companies think it's just they focus on site. No, if you have it needs to include off site elements too. So if, for example, Christmas parties, right? We're
There you
Christmas
go.
time now. So if you're at a bar or a restaurant, someplace you rent it out, the policy needs to state that the workplace violence prevention policy applies to those locations too, after hours, as long as it's a work function. The second thing that's important is it needs to state disciplinary action. If your policy doesn't identify potential disciplinary consequences, then it's not a policy, or it's a very weak policy. So that's very important. And the third absolutely important thing is some reporting procedures, mandatory and recommended, right? So mandatory if something, and it depends on state law also, but if, say, let's take a restraining order on a spouse or former spouse, that needs to be, if there's a workplace nexus, that needs to be mandatory or recommended in the workplace violence policy. So those are some of the top ones that absolutely have to be in workplace violence prevention policy. There are others too, but those are the top ones.
No, that's awesome. Thank you for that, because it's important, and I think it's a great time to think about like you just mentioned, the extension of that policy to beyond the workplace.
Right.
If it's a work-related function like a Christmas party, a holiday party, some sort of, I don't know, maybe award ceremony, something, right? Something that's off-site. Hey, this is a work-related function. Those policies that we had in place, at your desk this morning apply tonight when we're out and about.
Right.
And I think that may not be communicated to the employees the way that it should be. And so employers out there need to, maybe send out a reminder email the afternoon of
Right.
an event that's going on that evening and say, hey, we want to make sure everybody has a good time tonight. But remember, the workplace, policies that we have here extend to the event this evening. Just keep that in mind. Have a great time, blah, blah, blah. And so that would be something that really should be included in their sort of their daily operations, their
Exactly.
sort of checklist, if you will, before some event, whether it's a conference, whether it's a dinner or a party, et cetera. So
Right.
that's a really good point, especially this around a holiday time.
Right.
Now, we hear a lot about active shooter training, so I have to touch on it here because this is sort of part and parcel of the workplace violence thing, and even though it is something that is a rare event, we don't want to just stick our heads in the sand and think it's not going to happen to me, because every single person that was ever the victim of an active shooter event said the same thing. Never thought it would happen to me, right? And the same holds true for people that are victims of other crimes, right? Whether it's a burglary or some other sort of, a kidnapping, whatever it happens to be, everybody's going to say the same thing. Oh my God, I never thought it was going to happen to me. So we know that it's important to conduct active shooter training in a lot of different businesses, obviously in schools and whatnot. But what are some other components that should be included in the workplace violence training? Because I think the active shooter training is sort of an easy one to just say, oh, we do active shooter training to handle our workplace violence. Well, there's a lot of other stuff. You got disgruntled employees, person just got fired. They're coming in with, now they're all pissed off because, they don't know why, they don't understand. Maybe it wasn't communicated to them properly. I had another gentleman on the show. He talked all about that, sometimes having an independent third party sit in on that. So what other elements should be included apart from just like the active shooter training with regard to workplace violence training?
Sure. So, there are different levels. So for all employees, you want to include there's the response piece, right? Here's what you do: run, hide, fight. Not necessarily in that order. That's important.
Right.
Or even if you use some other methodology other than run, hide, fight, that's the response. That's very important. For and also policies. You during that training, you want to reiterate, hey, we have a policy against bullying, for example. For management, supervisors, executives, you want to, in the training, you might want to have separate training that includes warning behaviors. So that's important. So there's way too much empirical evidence out there to ignore that and not provide that to executives and management and supervisors. And that's something that we provide. So for example, and you see it almost every day, every time there's an active shooter, there are a lot of times warning behaviors. So for example, just off the top of my head, fixation is one, right, is an example that I'll briefly talk about. If someone is there's a recent shooter who he forced his, I think it was the last active shooter, he forced his girlfriend to watch videos of mass shootings, right? I think it was the New Zealand shooting at the mosque.
Mm-hmm.
Just repeatedly forced her to do it. That's fixation. When you start when someone's professional or personal life starts to be influenced by their by compulsively watching videos and other things, or focusing on people who've committed prior acts of violence. That's fixation. That's a red flag. So that's just an example of one of several warning behaviors it would be good to train some management supervisors on.
Yeah, and unfortunately, people don't want to be the one, right, that says, hey, I think there might be a problem here. But hey, better safe than sorry anymore. And I think people are starting to realize that when you see these warning sign behaviors, don't ignore them. And unfortunately, we see it all the time. People have made posts on social media just prior to doing one of these events. Well, the people that see that, you've got to reach out. You got to say, hey, I know so-and-so, and they just put this really disturbing post out on their timeline, and I'm not really sure what it means, but there's something, strange about it. And, I think it may warrant somebody checking into it. If it turns out to be, quote, nothing, all right, well, so maybe you inconvenience somebody, but at the same time, what's the alternative? Would you rather inconvenience somebody on what could potentially be a catastrophic act of violence, or ignore it and then after the fact go, I should have said something?
And that's an example of that example there with posts on social media. That's another one behavior, leakage, right? And the vast majority of active shooters, they have leakage where it's not a threat. Especially not a direct threat, but they basically leak that on social media or in comments to folks. A lot of times that doesn't get reported. I think society's getting better at that now. They're getting more risk literate in terms of that. So that's good, but we're not where we should be in terms of organizations.
So when an organization is taking a look, maybe they're listening to this episode that, when we're talking about, policies and procedures, and they're thinking, you know what, I should go take a look at what my policies say. What would you recommend to an organization in terms of how they should go about evaluating what they currently have?
Sure. So the big thing is to hire. It's always good to hire an outside expert. So to do that risk assessment of that policy, I think that's the biggest thing. Have an outside expert come in and look at your policy, and they might find things that you might not otherwise see. That's the key, and that's not done enough, and not just for businesses, but that needs to be done for events also, because you should have policies for special events also. Now,
at a special event, obviously, or even at work, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a man-made act of violence. We could be talking about natural disasters as well. And, just like you plan for a fire or a flood, you plan now for workplace violence and active shooters and things like that. So both of these can affect businesses. what should a business look for regarding, policies that have to do with the business continuity aspect of this?
Sure. So there are, there are some basics. First of all, do you have a policy in place? Period. That's
Right. Yeah, it's number one.
And then risk assessment too. A lot of times there's overlap between a risk assessment for security, a risk assessment for business continuity. In fact, you could sometimes use the same data for that. In fact, some folks argue you should use the same data for that.
Mm-hmm.
So your risk assessment in business continuity that results in your business impact, that should be feed in your your security policy too. So making sure that you have that risk assessment in place, having that buy-in from leadership for that's important for business continuity as it is for security, right? And disaster recovery. You need that top level buy-in from the CEO or head honcho, whoever he or she is, or the CO somewhere at that level. So those are some big ones. And then I would also make sure that you talking about recovery time objective, recovery point objective. At what point do you want to recover or be able to recover your data or your business operations? There are various, without getting into a lot of details, business continuity. Those are some big picture, top level things. Risk assessment, policy in place, upper, senior level buy-in.
So one of for those of the viewers that are or listeners that are watching this, the video of this, I'm pulling up the website again, as I have been doing throughout here to highlight some of the things that you guys do there at Blue Glacier. For those who are just listening to this, make sure you go and check out blueglacierllc.com for some of this information. So like right now, what you're talking about, in terms of the services, these include things like, warning of potential threats and insights, for example, into current events. What are some of the key things that are going around in the geopolitical space, right? What's happening that could potentially impact your business? Of course, situational awareness, which, obviously you're taught in the military. A lot of people aren't as familiar with that. What I tell people is you need to be, quote, armed with awareness, right? Because if you're armed with awareness, it's not like a gun or a knife or a club or pepper spray or a flashlight or something to be taken away from you, right? It's something that you can be armed with all the time, and you should be armed with all the time. Right. And so that's a biggie. And then, of course, long-term assessments, things like, travel, how can you be impacted when you're traveling? And then you have here intelligence cycle and sources. Signals intelligence, imagery intelligence, human intelligence. Can you kind of just give us a real quick summary of what those all kind of fall under this intelligence cycle and sources piece? Sure.
So a lot of people see that, so, oh, you're a government contractor. Well, yeah, we provide services to the government. We have the capability to do that, but you need to understand the intelligence cycle if you are a private business. For example, cyber, right? So that's one thing that we'd like to do more of, is basically teach cyber folks how to do intel, because you need to know what you're defending against. So the intelligence cycle within the government should not be much different than it is in the private sector. So
yeah, it carries over. Just because it's something developed for government, right? It was developed for government. Take advantage of it. Use it.
Right? Exactly. And it's a well proven concept cycle. So of course there'll be less human intelligence, maybe less geo-int imagery intelligence in the government, but not so much. You're seeing more capabilities develop, especially on the imagery side. So basically, organizations need to be able to do that task and intelligence cycle to help drive things like their cyber defenses.
Yeah, one of the things that I have, and you're probably going to be familiar with this there, Kofi, is OODA, right? OODA.
OODA loop, right.
And I tell businesses use that, right? I mean, because it's something that was, the military developed, but I mean, that's essentially giving you the tactics to, respond to a crisis, right? I mean, you observe, orient, decide, and then act.
Exactly.
And it's a great way to approach a problem, right? Because you have to observe everything that's going on in the company, from the infrastructure.
Right.
You know, you apply prioritization to different things. You look at the latest threat intelligence. You look at what risks are out there. I tell businesses, and look at the ones that are realistic. Like, don't get yourself hung up on things that you have no control over. Like, if an asteroid hits the planet, we're all screwed. Don't worry about it, right?
Right. Exactly.
If there's a zombie apocalypse, we're all screwed. Don't worry about it. So, and is it really realistic, right? So, certain things could be threats, could be risks, but if they are of a global impact and they affect everybody, and there's nothing anybody can do about it, don't concern yourself with it, right? Look at the ones that are realistic to your business. You know, somebody hacking in, somebody stealing data, an employee who's being blackmailed and trying to steal, company files off your network, something like that. Those are the things that you need to look at. Those are the things you need to focus on, and then orient your resources around that, right? The other O.
Right.
And then, of course, decide, all right, based on all of that, in the first couple steps, decide on what those next steps are, and then finally, act on the things that you've decided to do.
And a lot of that's part of the risk literacy piece, risk literacy I was talking about, where, if you're a tiny organization out in rural Utah, rural Wyoming, you probably shouldn't be as concerned with terrorism as,
Right.
For example, a defense firm or financial firm on Wall Street.
Now, we talked about how it's important to have these policies and procedures extend beyond the workplace to parties or dinners or conferences or things like that. We could also then extend that and extrapolate that out to travel, right? Because you're traveling for business. So those safety and security policies should also cover business travel and duty of care and things like that, correct?
Absolutely. And it's the same thing in terms of the legal implications, and also regulatory implications, but especially legal implications. An organization does not want to be at the receiving end of a lawsuit. If you have overseas travel, something happens, lawyers come back and ask, okay, something happened to your employee, kidnapping or whatever. What are your policies to cover this?
How many companies probably have a policy on that? I don't think too
Right.
many.
Not too many. You need to have a duty of care policy written. I don't care what your guidelines are, what your procedures are. Have that policy in place, or unless you're just setting yourself up for failure in the court system.
Yeah, and that's nobody wants that. One of the things that we've talked about on the show before is staying safe at concerts and special events and stuff. You had done a presentation at the ASIS Global Security Exchange. You've also written for Homeland Security Today magazine, and you talk about something called Protect the P3. Obviously, that's something you feel is important. What is that?
Right. So basically, and I might change it to protect the three Ps, because P3 sometimes means the principle number 3 in the executive protection world, which based on my EP experience. But basically, it's protect the first thing is protect the performer. That's important. And in my presentation at ACES a couple years ago, I gave or last year, I gave specific examples and showed videos of that happening, where that all around the world too, where they didn't do a good job of that. Either the performance protective detail or event staff. That's important. The second P is protect the patrons. That does not, unfortunately, that doesn't happen often, or it doesn't happen well. So the most extreme example, sometimes you'll see barriers fall, people get injured, sometimes fall in as much as 10 feet. It also results in security being too good. So the shooting in Mexico a couple of years ago at the electronic dance music festival, where patrons could not escape. They had to be catapulted over by fellow patrons over a big gate in the back, right? So that they did a good job of the third P, which is protect the pocketbook, which is keep folks from coming in, who aren't ticketed, but it was too good of a job where it didn't protect patrons because they couldn't escape from the shooter. It was gang related or cartel related. They couldn't escape the shooter that came in through the front. So those are the P3: protect the pocketbook, protect the patrons, protect the performer, and all too often one or more of those is not done well.
No, that was great, and I think that now a lot of people are gonna be like, oh, okay, it makes sense, right? The performer, the patrons, and the pocketbook. You got to protect the financial interests of the organization or the event.
Right.
Now, you've obviously got a very strong intelligence background, working with the military. Again, thank you for your service. That's awesome.
Thanks.
And you also, in some of your writings, you talk about the importance of intelligence in security operations. And obviously that comes from your military background. So some people say, well, I don't have a military background. I'm not quite sure where to sort of begin or how to move that piece of it forward. So maybe you could give some examples of how intelligence can be used, and then maybe where it was not used or was not paid attention to.
Sure. So some organizations do this extremely well. You have a stalker who exhibits the warning behaviors, right? So that's the protective intelligence piece. So that comes in really well. They report that to police, and and they modify their protective detail to based on that threat. That's great. So two quick examples of that not working well: the shooting at the Reina nightclub New Year's Eve a couple of years ago in Turkey, Turkey. The intelligence could not have been better. The owner himself publicly admitted that the U.S. officials had told him, "Hey, something might go down." ISIS had the year prior had intended to target New Year's Eve celebrations. They were thwarted, but they made it very clear that they wanted to target New Year's Eve celebrations. Yet security was almost non-existent. In terms of private security at the club and also police response. Shooter went in, ISIS shooter went in and basically murdered over 30 people. Another quick example is the bombings in Southeast Asia earlier this year, right? Where it couldn't have happened. The intel couldn't have been better. Where the police chief, military intelligence, basically got wind of this from the Indians, and because of certain biases, that resulted in almost no increase in security, and their bombings at churches in the area. So when you don't listen to intelligence, bad things can happen.
Well, let's we're gonna have to get wrapped up, but I gotta ask you about the big event coming up next year, which is the Olympics in Tokyo in 2020. That obviously could be a target for terrorism, right? You have millions and millions of people all gathered in a small area,
right.
And so you have your sort of your imagination can run wild on the types of scenarios that could occur, right? From a dirty bomb to biological to who knows what it could be, to active shooter, right?
Right.
Maybe you could briefly talk about how do you go about even beginning to analyze and think about and plan for an event of that magnitude?
Sure. So it's hard. I did some unofficial red teaming. That was part of my presentation at Global Security Exchange this year, and unfortunately, two of the things that I concluded or red teamed on actually have happened or partly happened. One is the Fukushima radiation. That's one of the things I had red team, in addition to radioactive poisoning that's man-made. But the Fukushima thing, you look at it from an enterprise security management standpoint, it's not all about bad guys, right? And so the Japanese officials found some hot spots near Fukushima, and was only about 20, 30 miles south the venue is only about 20, 30 miles south of Fukushima.
Oh, wow.
Right. Yeah. So that's one thing I'd mentioned in my presentation when I red teamed it. The other is the dope banning of the Russians. The last time that happened, both Rio 2016 Summer Olympics and also Pyeongchang Olympics, Winter Olympics in 2018, the Russians basically unleashed cyber hell against doping organizations and Olympic officials.
Oh, wow.
So that's something I mentioned in my presentation. And just last week, that's the recommendation from one of the doping agencies that Russia be banned from the Olympics. That the complete banning probably won't happen for various reasons, but look for that to impact cyber defenses at the Olympics. So if you are an organization sponsor, go into the Olympics, if you're going to have folks there in Tokyo, you need to bring your A game with cyber.
Wow. So that's good advice there. So if people are interested in learning about you, about your company, Blue Glacier, they can obviously, as I mentioned, the website a couple of times, blueglacierllc.com. I'm sure social media, I see you sent over to me, and I will be posting different social media links. But basically, if they search for Blue Glacier on any of the social media networks, they'll find you guys, right?
Absolutely. We're have a presence on Twitter, Facebook. Those are our most active, and LinkedIn also. Those are our 3 most active social media platforms.
Awesome.
And you could also connect with me, K.Campbell or K.Campbell at initial K, Campbell CPP on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, really appreciate you coming on. You got any last thoughts for our audience before I let you go?
Everyone should try to increase their risk literacy. It's not always the bad things that might happen or might not be what we think they are. It might not all be about active shooters. It might be cyber. It might be radiation. It might be natural disasters. Just increase your risk literacy.
Awesome. Great advice, and appreciate you coming on the show there, Coffee. And we will be getting you some information on this. I'll have to connect with you afterwards. I got got to run now, but again, really appreciate you coming on, and thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on, Pete.
All right. Thanks. And thanks for our listeners for tuning in, and get more information as well as past episodes at safetytalkpodcast.com, as well as your favorite podcast network. Until next time, stay safe.